A very good Tuesday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us today as we are continuing our study through the book of First Samuel, which is a part of our larger study that we are calling Walking Through History. We began in Genesis many moons ago, and now we are working our way through the story of the Bible, which we believe to be history. We believe these to be real historical events that God has preserved for us through his providence so that we can know where we come from and what he expects for us to do, and how we are where we are today, living under the rule of Christ. We have seen already in our studies numerous prophecies concerning the coming Messiah and the coming Christ. And that certainly helps to build our faith, to know that God has always had a plan for what he desires for his people. And he has been active in making sure that that plan is accomplished. And we're going to continue to see that today. In fact, as we get into First Samuel chapter 9, we're going to see, or we're going to be introduced to the one who will be the first king of Israel. And even as we look at him and the roles that he is going to serve, we're going to see some allusions to Christ and who he is going to be once he arrives on the scenes many hundreds of years from now, within the text at least. Thank you so much for being here. Hope this will be a great study for all of us. It'll be a blessing to us within our faiths. Joining me as always is my good friend Alan String. And Alan, when we were studying last week, we looked at chapter 8, where the people longed for a king. And we talked about how this is kind of a tough text because it's not inherently wrong, but it's also not inherently good the way they go about this, and the kind of the attitude that they have. We talked about how this seems to have been, again, a part of God's plan all along. And now we're going to see that plan, the portion where kings are going to be a part of the ruling of God's people. We're going to see that introduced today. Why don't you get us into the text and start talking about this guy named Saul?
It's kind of interesting. At the end of chapter 8, we're kind of left with this cliffhanger. They asked for a king. Samuel was kind of, he wasn't really cool with that idea. And he argues with them a little bit and talks to God. And God's like, just, go for it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. Give them what they asked for. And he says, appoint for them a king. And then nothing happens. Samuel just tells them, go back home. So you're kind of left with that cliffhanger. If you don't know the rest of the story, you assume that maybe that'll get taken care of in the next chapters or two, which it does, but we don't really know what's going on. But then you're introduced to this new guy, a prominent man of Benjamin, verse 1, named Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bekorah, son of Aphiah, son of a Benjamite, and he had a son named Saul, an impressive young man. There was no one more impressive among the Israelites than he. He stood a head taller than anyone else. Interesting thing about the name Saul, it means asked for or requested. So you've already got some ties back to what they just asked for, a king. So if you're reading the Hebrew, you're like, oh, here's a guy named asked for and king, or asked for, requested. So you've got some literary ties that kind of tie these things together. And we're immediately impressed with the man because it says he's an impressive young man. He's from a prominent Benjamite clan. He stood a head taller than anyone else. So we're starting off, really good. This sounds like a king. Well, as the story progresses, it's nothing too terrible, but you kind of see some chinks in that armor as we go. Verse 3, one day the donkeys of Saul's father Kish wandered off. Kish said to his son Saul, take one of the servants with you and go look for the donkeys. Saul and his servant went through the hill country of Ephraim and then through the region of Shalisha, and they didn't find them. They went through the region of Shalem, nothing. Then they went through the Benjamite region, but still couldn't find them. When they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, come on, let's go back, or my father will stop worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about us. So you get that first kind of, he was told to go find the donkeys. This isn't just, I lost a few dollars or something. Donkeys were expensive and, important. And he's already kind of given up here. So he kind of doesn't sound like the greatest guy. And then the servant has an idea. Look, verse 6, the servant said, there's a man of God in this city who is highly respected. Everything he says is sure to come true. Let's go there now. Maybe he'll tell us which way we should go." "Suppose we do go," Saul said to his servant. "What do we take the man? The food from our packs is gone, and there's no gift to take to the man of God. What do we have?" The servant answered Saul, "Here, I have a little silver. I'll give it to the man of God, and he will tell us which way we should go." Formerly in Israel, a man who is going to inquire of God would say, "Come, let's go to the seer," for the prophet of today was formerly called a seer. Kind of an interesting um, little aside by the editors, and you get a little bit of a timestamp here because obviously this is happening formally, which makes sense. Obviously, the person wouldn't be writing this in real time. This is obviously a recording, and they put this together. So this is during the days when they called prophets and not seers like they used to. So you get these every now and then during the Bible story. Back to Saul here in verse 10. "Good," Saul replied to his servant. "Come on, let's go." So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they were climbing the hill to the city, they found some young women coming out to draw water and asked, "Is the seer here?" The woman answered, "Yes, he is ahead of you. Hurry, he just now entered the city because there's a sacrifice for the people at the high place today. As soon as you enter the city, you will find him before he goes to the high place to eat. The people won't eat until he comes because he must bless the sacrifice. After that, the guests can eat. Go up immediately. You can find him now." So they went up toward the city. Saul and his servant now entered the city. Now entering the city, Saul and his servant were entering the city when they saw Samuel coming toward them on his way to the high place. Now the day before Saul's arrival, the Lord had informed Samuel, "At this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him over my people Israel. He will save them from the Philistines, because I had seen the affliction of my people, for their cry has come to me." When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, "Here is the man I told you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the city gate and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" This is kind of interesting because where Saul lives in Benjamin and where this city is really not too far. I think it's 5 miles or something like that. It's in the area. So you get the sense that Saul, I mean, well, obviously he doesn't know what Samuel looks like. They haven't even called him Samuel. They've just called him the seer. Um, you just get the sense like Saul has no connection or no understanding of who this guy is. Well, Samuel's pretty old. Obviously, he's been around for a long time at this point. He's got sons that are leaders in Israel. He's been a leader in Israel. All Israel knows who he is. Why doesn't Saul know who he is? I can understand maybe not recognizing him, but it's more than that. I mean, you have the women kind of explaining what's going on with this big sacrifice, this event. Well, again, this is happening close by. Obviously, if Samuel's here, it's an important city, an important place. You would think that everyone around would at least know the customs, know the rituals, especially a big sacrifice like this. They would know about Samuel. You just get the sense that Saul is just kind of living in his little bubble. He lives in his father's house. He doesn't really get out. He's not really interested in, you know, seeing the world. He's not interested in getting out of his little area, and definitely not interested in any sort of spiritual activity. Learning about Saul, traveling. I mean, he's never traveled here before to whatever this event is, so he doesn't go to these religious exercises or religious festivals ever. So you're kind of seeing, maybe I'm reading more into this than I should, but it makes sense given the state of Saul's religious life as we see the story progress. You just kind of get the sense that he's not he's definitely not a Samuel. He's definitely not a David. More kind of we've already seen some links with him and Samson. Seems like more of a Samson. He's going to be he's going to deliver the people from the Philistines, but not really much in the way of spiritual maturity or desire to serve God in any increased way. See, let's pick up here in verse 19. I am the seer, Samuel answered. Go up ahead of me to the high place and eat with me today. When I send you off in the morning, I'll tell you everything that's in your heart. As for the donkeys that wandered off in the morning, I'll tell that away. As for the donkeys that wandered away from you 3 days ago, don't worry about them because they've been found. And who does all Israel desire but you and all your father's family? Saul responded, am I not a Benjamite from the smallest of Israel's tribes? And isn't my clan the least important of all the clans of the Benjamite tribe? So why have you said something like this to me? I kind of wonder about this because it said he was from a prominent family. Yes, Benjamin is the smallest tribe, but it seemed like it said he was from a prominent family, and he says he's not that important. So is this, I wonder if this is, humility on his part, or just, trying to kind of stay away from things, which we'll see later. He does want to kind of hide and hide in amongst the baggages, the packaging and all that. So you get that we're starting to kind of piece together Saul's personality here, even just from this short story. 22, Samuel took Saul and his servant, brought them to the banquet hall, and gave them a place at the head of the 30 or so men who had been invited. Samuel said to the cook, get the portion of meat that I gave you and told you to set aside. The cook picked up the thigh and what was attached to it and set it before Saul. Then Samuel said, notice that the reserved piece is set before you. Eat it because it was saved for you for this solemn event at the time I said, I've invited the people. So Saul ate with Samuel that day. Afterward, they went down from the high place to the city, and Samuel spoke with Saul on the roof. They got up early, and just before dawn, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, get up, and I'll send you on your way. Saul got up, and both he and Samuel went outside. As they were going down to the edge of the city, Samuel said to Saul, tell the servant to go on ahead of us, but you stay for a while, and I'll reveal the word of God to you. So the servant went on. So this is... we're to the end of the chapter, but obviously this story is gonna continue in our next class. But you're starting to get some pieces of Saul's personality, some of his character flaws. Mm-hmm. They make more sense as we read the story. That's why it'd be tough to pick these out right away. But when we have more chapters about Saul and his kind of failure, but it's kind of interesting. This is, Saul's name is asked for, requested. So you're starting to see that, yes, God is going to give them what they want, but not exactly what they want. They asked for a king, and Saul is going to be a little bit different. I think he's going to lean almost more toward like one of the judges, as like a Gideon or a Samson. Even later on, we're going to see the use of the word ruler instead of king. So he's going to give them a ruler. He has heard them back in, where was it?
15.
15, is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah. Oh, no, 16. So,
16.
Yeah, he will save them from the Philistines because I have seen the affliction of my people, for their cry is coming. So God is going to give them... he hears that they are afflicted. They need that protection. So he's going to provide that for them. But will he really provide a king in the sense that they want, or are they getting more of a judge ruler with Saul? We're going to call him a king. In some ways he is, and he's treated that way. But I think God's giving them something in between, more leaning more the judge ruler, which was the pattern that has been the pattern before, because I think the true king, that's a man after God's own heart, isn't there yet. It's not ready yet. So they have to wait. Saul's kind of the bridge between the two, if you would. What are your thoughts on this chapter, Nick?
Yeah, I think what you're saying about kind of seeing the kinks in the armor, or the chinks in the armor, whichever term you use, of Saul, it plays into what you mentioned in our last study about, and we were talking about the plan that God always had for kings, and yet it seems as if the people here are jumping the gun on wanting that king, and therefore to give them a king that really isn't everything that you would hope for a king to be. That makes sense. There's certainly a number of of connections between Saul and Samuel here in a number of different respects. We talked about the name Saul, meaning asks for, and it's actually very similar to the name of Samuel. Samuel, back in chapter 1, at the end of verse 20, talks about Hannah conceiving and giving birth to a son, and she named him Samuel because she said, I requested him from the Lord. So there's a connection there. And you also see, as this text goes on and the story goes on between Samuel and Saul, almost as if Saul takes a place of the sons that Samuel has that were no good for, that were good for nothing. Joel and Abijah, who are mentioned in chapter 8, they're not good. They did not walk in his ways. They turned towards his honest prophet, took bribes, and perverted justice. So we have this continuation, kind of replacing sons. That Eli's sons were no good, so Samuel kind of replaced them. And then here Samuel's sons are no good, and Saul kind of replaces them. And Samuel takes Saul under his wing and tries to groom him and make him into the king that he needs to be. But really, what stands out to me in this chapter, Alan, if I'm going to sum it up with one word, is providence. That what's taking place in this chapter is not coincidental in any respect. It didn't just, it's not just happenstance. This was the Lord working to provide for the people the king that they wanted, because it starts off very innocuously, just kind of random. There's this guy and he's got a son, and they lost some donkeys. So then they got to go find some donkeys. They go on this scavenger hunt for donkeys. And it just so happens that as they're doing that they're around this place where the man of God is. And it just so happens that as they're going along the way, as they're climbing the mountain, they just happen to run into some young women who are drawing water out of a well, which we've seen that multiple times throughout the story already. Prominent figures within the Bible story running into women at wells, and that being kind of a turning point and signaling that something's about to happen. We could think about that with Abraham. We could think about that with Isaac and Jacob. It's an aspect of the story that ought to clue us in that something's about to happen. And then all along the way, as it's going on, we see what we're seeing here is the rise of Saul to the kingship, but we're also figuratively seeing just ascension time and time again, which is showing us that is leading up to something. Talk about climbing the hill to the city, verse 11. They're told to go up immediately in verse number 13, that they went up in verse 14, and they come to this place. They come into the city. They saw Samuel going toward them on his way to the high place. And then you highlighted verse 15 and 16 and 17. And I think that's really important, because this really sets the tone for this entire narrative from 9:1 through chapter 10, that showing that this was God being involved here. And what's really interesting to me about this, and what I love about this text, what it teaches us about God, is the fact that God, even whenever his people are unfaithful, he is really ready to jump back in and help them as best he can. Reading a couple of different places, one of them being Davis and the Focus on the Bible commentary. He says this about this text. He says, not only is 9:15 through 17 the key for interpreting all of 9:1 through 10:16, but it is also the lens for magnifying Yahweh's mercy in light of chapter 8. Remember, chapter 8, they were clamoring for something that it wasn't time for them to have yet. They wanted things their way. So these foolish and stubborn people, Davis goes on to say, they do not cease to be the objects of Yahweh's compassions. Again, let no sin be glossed over. Let no one excuse its God-denying wickedness. But surely if you're a child of God, you rejoice to see that your God is mulish, which punny there for this text, on mercy, and that your sin does not dry up the fountain of his compassions, and that his pity refuses to let go of his people. And then he quotes Psalm 103 and verse 11, I believe, as the height of heaven above earth is, so strong is his faithful love for those who fear him. Here we have a people who are being very obstinate. They themselves are being mulish in a sense, wanting what they want, to be like the people around them, to have what the people around them have. And yet, even with this, God is going to still take care of them. And there's another man by the last name of Blakey, who looks at this and he says that this is what the Lord is waiting for from his people. Even if they are being rebellious, he just wants to hear them crying out to him. And it's not that God is unaware of the afflictions of his people. Again, we go back to Exodus. We can look at various struggles from there to here within this point of history. God's people have endured a lot of difficulties, almost all, if not all, of their own doing. And yet, what God is doing is He's waiting for them to just reach out to Him to say, "Hey, we need your help. We can't do this without you. Will you please save us?" There's the cry in verse 16. I have seen the affliction of my people, for their cry has come to me. And that's all God needs. That's all He wants, is our dependence upon Him, so that His compassion then can become active and could show the mercy that He has for those who love Him. And that ought to uh, really cause us to appreciate God's character all the more. That even when we are rebellious, that doesn't. I love the way David says this. It does not dry up the fountain of his compassions. Even whenever we are rebellious, that does not cause God to no longer desire to help us and to serve us. And that is seen throughout this text, is that Saul continuing this ascension, continuing to be seen as being the one who is chosen, and and God's doing all this again through his prophet Samuel, who he had not been using prophets. We go back to chapter 3, we remember that there had not been a word of the Lord being spoken of here. So again, just to sum all this up, it is providence here in every single respect. God is not just setting things up to happen, but He's just providing for His people. And I think that's very powerful. I think that ought to be something that we really take away from this chapter. God providing, and especially emphasizing His providing even in the face of rebellion of His people. As soon as they turn and they need Him and they desire Him and they want Him, He's quick to turn back and to show His love and compassion for them. That really stands out to me here in this chapter.
And speaking of providence, we'll kind of pick up with 10, and we see God, and of course Samuel explaining to Saul what's going to happen, and even giving him some signs to,
Right.
just like in the way he helped Gideon kind of come to that higher level of faith, just to understand what's going on. He gives him some signs as well. So Saul's going to get these signs, and then it's going to lead to his anointing and his becoming king by the end of the chapter.
Yeah, and remember that's kind of the introduction that Saul had to this man of God, Samuel. Back in verse number 6, the servant said, "There's a man of God in the city who is highly respected, and everything he says is sure to come true." And those words should be on the forefront of our minds as we're going through chapter 10, looking at these predictions that Samuel is going to make, and giving him the proof, giving Saul the proof that this is the will of God, that these things are going to take place, and through them taking place, you will know that you are where God wants you to be. Yeah, Alan, anything else in the text before we close for today?
Kind of a negative point about that verse is, everything he says is sure to come true. Well, Samuel's going to, throughout the rest of this book, he's going to say some pretty negative things
That's
about
true.
Saul as well. Even at the day before the last day of his life, he's going to predict his death. So, and it comes true just as Samuel says. So, some positive and negative foreshadowing there.
This is true. We'll be getting into that here shortly over the next few weeks as we continue our studies through this text. But we'll be getting back into this text on Friday here in 1 Samuel chapter 10. If you have any questions or comments about what we talked about today, please feel free to leave that in the comment box. And if we can serve you in any way, please feel free to reach out as well. We'd love to do that for you if we can. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. May God bless you in all that you do, and I hope you'll join us on Friday as we continue our walk through history in 1 Samuel chapter 10. God bless you, and we'll see you soon.